The stars looked peaceful from the observation deck of the USS Valiant, but Captain Daniel Morgan knew that peace was about to shatter into a million pieces. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the emergency transmission that had arrived 3 hours ago from the outer rim colony called New Haven. The message was garbled and filled with static, but the screaming in the background told him everything he needed to know. Something terrible had happened to the 3,000 colonists who had made that distant world their home. The Valiant had been patrolling the border regions when the distress call came through, and Daniel had immediately ordered his crew to jump to faster than light speed toward the colony. They were still 2 days away, but other ships had already arrived at New Haven and sent back their initial reports. Daniel had watched those reports in his private quarters, and what he saw had made him grip the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. The colony was gone, reduced to smoking ruins and scattered debris. The Zaxian Empire had done this. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Hayes walked onto the bridge and handed Daniel a datapad with the latest casualty estimates. Her eyes were red and her voice shook slightly as she spoke. The rescue teams had found bodies in the wreckage, mostly small ones. Children who had been attending school when the bombardment began. Families who had been eating breakfast together. Elderly colonists who had retired to New Haven to enjoy their final years in peace. The Zaxian warships had targeted the residential areas first, ensuring that the people who couldn't fight back would die first. Daniel read through the reports and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had served in the Earth Defense Force for 23 years and had seen combat before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle between military forces. This was murder, plain and simple. The Zaxian Empire had given the colonists exactly 1 hour to evacuate the entire planet, knowing full well that families with young children couldn't possibly gather their belongings and reach the spaceport in time. When the hour expired, the Zaxian ships had opened fire without any further warning. The transmission logs showed that the colony administrator had begged for more time. He had explained that they had infants and elderly people who needed special care during evacuation. The Zaxian commander had responded with a single word before cutting the communication. No. Then the orbital bombardment had begun, and 3,000 human lives had ended in fire and thunder. The Zaxian had used their heaviest weapons, the kind designed to crack open military bunkers and fortified positions. They had used them on homes and schools and hospitals. Lisa coordinated with the rescue ships as they continued to search through the ruins. Each transport that returned to the orbital station carried another cargo hold full of casualties. Most were so badly burned that identification was impossible without genetic testing. The rescue workers moved through the debris with grim faces, knowing that every pile of rubble might hide another victim. They found a schoolroom where 20 children had huddled together with their teacher, seeking shelter that never came. They found a hospital nursery where 8 newborns had died in their cribs. Back on Earth, Admiral Patricia Cole sat in her office at the Unified Defense Command and read the same reports that Daniel was reading. She was a tall woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her face could have been carved from granite as she processed the information. She had grandchildren the same age as some of the victims, and she had to force herself to remain professional as she read about how they died. The Zaxian ambassador was scheduled to arrive at Earth within 6 hours to deliver his government's official statement about the incident. Patricia knew what that statement would say before the ambassador even arrived. The Zaxian Empire would claim that New Haven had been built in contested territory, that humanity had been warned repeatedly to abandon their colonial claims in that region. They would say that the colonists were illegal settlers who had refused to leave despite multiple diplomatic notifications. They would call it a legal military action under interstellar law, a necessary response to human expansionism. They would express regret for the loss of life but insist that humanity bore responsibility for placing civilians in a conflict zone. The media across human space had already begun broadcasting images from New Haven. Every news station showed the same footage on repeat, rescue workers in protective suits carefully lifting small covered bodies from the wreckage. A child's toy, a stuffed bear lying in the ashes next to a crater, a school bus that had been trying to reach the spaceport, now a twisted sculpture of melted metal with tiny shoes scattered around it. Parents who had been working off-world on business trips watched these broadcasts and collapsed when they learned their entire families were gone. Daniel finally arrived at New Haven 2 days after the attack, and he insisted on going down to the surface personally. Lisa tried to convince him to stay on the ship, to let the rescue teams handle the grim work, but he refused. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to understand exactly what had happened here. When the shuttle landed at what used to be the main settlement, Daniel stepped out onto ground that was still warm from the bombardment. The air smelled of smoke and chemicals and death. He walked through the ruins with a rescue team, past the skeleton of what had been a shopping center where families bought groceries, past a playground where the metal swings had melted into abstract shapes, past a residential street where you could still see the outlines of houses in the ash. The rescue team leader, a sergeant named Paul Sanders, pointed out where they had found the largest concentration of casualties. The elementary school. The Zaxian had hit it with 3 separate strikes, ensuring complete destruction. Daniel knelt in the rubble and picked up a child's drawing that had somehow survived the flames. It showed a family standing in front of a house with a yellow sun overhead and the words, "My home on New Haven," written across the top in crayon. He carefully folded the drawing and put it in his pocket. He would keep it as a reminder of what had been lost here, of what the Zaxian Empire had done to innocent people, who had only wanted to build a better life on a new world. When the Zaxian ambassador arrived at Earth, he was a tall reptilian creature with green scales and cold yellow eyes. He delivered his government statement to the Unified Council with a voice that showed no emotion whatsoever. New Haven had been in disputed territory. The colonists had been warned. The Zaxian Empire regretted the necessity of military action, but stood by its territorial claims. Then the ambassador said something that would echo through human space for months to come. He said the colonists should have known better than to bring their offspring to a conflict zone. Patricia watched the ambassador speak, and she saw him smile slightly when he mentioned the children. It was a small expression, barely noticeable, but she caught it. The ambassador thought this was just another diplomatic incident, another negotiation over borders and territory. He thought humanity would file protests and demand reparations and eventually agree to some compromise. He thought humans were soft and peaceful and unwilling to fight. The ambassador had no idea what he had just awakened. Commander Jake Sullivan sat alone in the strategic planning room deep beneath Earth's military headquarters, surrounded by holographic displays showing every Zaxian star system and military installation. The blue light from the projections cast strange shadows across his face, but he didn't notice because he was completely focused on the data scrolling past his eyes. He had been in this room for 16 hours straight, studying Zaxian fleet movements and defense patterns, looking for weaknesses that humanity could exploit. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he kept drinking it anyway because stopping would mean thinking about why he was really here. Jake had lost his younger sister Caroline in the New Haven massacre, along with her 2 daughters Emma and Sophie. Emma had been 7 years old and loved drawing pictures of spaceships. Sophie had been 4 and was afraid of the dark, so Caroline always left a small light on in her room at night. Now they were gone, reduced to ashes on a distant world, and Jake would never see them again. He had watched the footage from New Haven exactly once, and that had been enough. The image of those small covered bodies being carried from the ruins was burned into his mind forever. The diplomatic corps had spent 3 weeks trying to negotiate with the Zaxian Empire after the massacre. Earth's ambassadors had presented evidence of war crimes to the Galactic Council, showing that the Zaxian had deliberately targeted civilian areas with military-grade weapons. They had documented every violation of interstellar law, every ignored plea for mercy, every murdered child. The Zaxian Empire had responded by claiming 2 more human colonies in disputed space and ordering their populations to evacuate within 24 hours. They were testing humanity, pushing to see how far they could go before humans finally pushed back. General Frank Morrison entered the planning room carrying a sealed folder with red security markings across the front. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with gray hair cut military short, and his expression was harder than Jake had ever seen it. Frank placed the folder on the table between them and entered his authorization code into the security lock. The folder opened with a soft click, and inside were the codes that would change everything. The Unified Earth Council had voted on the measure just 2 hours ago, and the result had been unanimous. Humanity was going to war. Jake looked at the authorization papers and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't going to be a police action or a peacekeeping mission, or a limited military response. The Council had declared total war against the Zaxian Empire, the first time in human history that such a declaration had been issued. There would be no rules of engagement beyond the basic laws of war. There would be no restricted target lists or prohibited weapons. Humanity was going to hit the Zaxian with everything they had, and they were going to keep hitting until the Zaxian begged for mercy. Dr. Helen Price worked in a classified research facility buried under 300 meters of solid rock in the mountains of Colorado. She was a small woman with dark hair starting to show gray at the temples, and she had spent her entire career developing defensive technologies to protect human colonies from natural disasters and accidents. Now she stood in front of a massive vault door, entering security codes that she had hoped never to use. Inside this vault were weapons that humanity had built during darker times, technologies that had been locked away because they were too dangerous and too cruel to ever use in civilized warfare. Helen had argued against developing these weapons when she was younger. She had believed that humanity should be better than that they should find ways to resolve conflicts without resorting to weapons of mass destruction. She had given speeches about the moral responsibility of scientists and the importance of restraining human violence. Now she was unlocking the vaults and authorizing production of every nightmarish weapon inside, and she felt no guilt whatsoever. The Zaxian had murdered human children and smiled about it. They were going to learn what happened when you awakened the dark side of humanity. Colonel Marcus Green briefed his special operations team in a secure facility, where even the walls were shielded against electronic surveillance. His team consisted of 48 of the best soldiers humanity had ever produced, men and women who could infiltrate enemy territory and complete impossible missions without leaving any trace. Marcus had led this team through a dozen operations over the past decade, always following strict rules about minimizing casualties and avoiding collateral damage. Today he was giving them a very different kind of mission. The main battle fleets would handle the Zaxian military forces, destroying their ships and orbital defenses in conventional warfare. Marcus and his team had a different objective. They were going to infiltrate the Zaxian homeworld and eliminate the leadership that had ordered the New Haven massacre. This wouldn't be done with bombs or missiles from orbit. This would be done up close and personal, so that every member of the Zaxian High Command would see human faces before they died. The galaxy needed to understand that humanity didn't just fight wars from a distance. When you murdered their children, humans would come for you in the dark. Across all of human space, the mobilization began with a speed that shocked the galactic community. Reserve fleets that had been mothballed for decades were brought back online and refitted with new weapons. Civilian shipyards that built cargo haulers and passenger liners retooled their production lines to build warships. Factories that produced consumer goods switched to manufacturing ammunition and military equipment. Within 2 weeks, humanity had tripled the size of its active military, and the ships kept coming off the production lines. The transformation happened so fast that intelligence services across the galaxy scrambled to understand what they were seeing. Humanity had always seemed so peaceful and reasonable, focused on exploration and trade rather than military conquest. They had small defense forces and avoided conflicts whenever possible. Now they were mobilizing for total war with an efficiency that suggested they had been planning for this possibility all along. The truth was simpler and more frightening. Humans were very good at cooperation when they had a common enemy. And right now every human in the galaxy had the same enemy. The Zaxian Empire's intelligence network finally began sending urgent reports to their leadership, warning that humanity's response was far larger than anticipated. The analysts predicted that human fleet strength would increase by 500% within a month. They recommended immediate diplomatic outreach to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. The Zaxian Emperor reviewed these reports in his palace on the homeworld and dismissed them as panic and overreaction. Humans had always been weak and conflict-averse. They would make some military gestures to save face, then return to the negotiating table. The Emperor instructed his military commanders to fortify the border regions and prepare for possible raids on outlying installations. He authorized the deployment of additional fleet groups to contested territories to reinforce their territorial claims. He believed that a show of strength would convince humanity to back down and accept the loss of New Haven as the price of their colonial expansion. Every decision he made was based on the assumption that humans were rational actors who would retreat when faced with superior force. Jake looked at the holographic displays showing Zaxian military deployments and allowed himself a cold smile. The Zaxian were preparing for the war they expected, not the war they were going to get. They thought humanity would fight a limited conflict over border regions and disputed colonies. They had no idea that human ships were already moving into position for strikes deep into Zaxian territory. They didn't understand that humanity wasn't interested in winning territory or negotiating better terms. Humanity wanted justice, and justice meant making the Zaxian pay in blood for every child they had murdered. Admiral Patricia Cole stood in the command center watching the deployment of human forces across a dozen star systems. Her staff worked efficiently around her, coordinating the largest military operation in human history. She had given the orders that would send thousands of young men and women into combat, knowing that many of them wouldn't come home. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, but she didn't hesitate because she understood what was at stake. The galaxy needed to learn that humanity had limits and the Zaxian had crossed them. The final pieces moved into position as the deadline approached. Human ships waited at the edges of Zaxian systems, their weapons charged and their crews ready. Special operations teams infiltrated Zaxian worlds, moving like ghosts through enemy territory. Intelligence networks that had been built over decades of peaceful contact suddenly activated, providing targeting data and strategic information. Everything was ready, and now humanity just needed to pull the trigger. The Zaxian Empire issued one final statement, declaring that humanity's military buildup was an act of aggression that justified defensive measures. They moved more ships into position and placed their home defense forces on high alert. They still believed they were the stronger power, that their superior numbers and experience would carry the day. They had fought and won 3 major wars in the past century. They had conquered 6 other species. They saw humanity as just another weak race that would fold under pressure. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The human fleet appeared at the edge of the Zaxian Tertius system, like a pack of wolves emerging from the darkness, their ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Admiral Patricia Cole stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the tactical display showing 60 Zaxian warships moving to intercept her 30 vessels. The Zaxian commanders were confident in their numerical advantage, sending communications demanding that the human fleet withdraw immediately or face destruction. Patricia listened to their threats and then gave the order that would change everything. She told her weapons officers to fire at will and leave nothing standing. The Zaxian defense fleet moved forward in their standard battle formation, the same tactics they had used successfully in 3 previous wars against other species. Their heavy cruisers formed the center line while lighter destroyers protected the flanks, and their commanders expected the humans to retreat when they saw the overwhelming firepower arrayed against them. Instead, the human ships accelerated directly toward the Zaxian formation, closing the distance at speeds that seemed reckless. The Zaxian opened fire first, their plasma cannons and missile batteries, launching a devastating barrage that should have crippled the approaching human vessels. Commander. Rachel Torres sat in the cockpit of her fighter as it launched from the carrier bay along with 200 other small craft. She had been a commercial pilot before the war, flying passenger shuttles between Earth and Mars, but she had volunteered for military service the day after New Haven. Her younger brother had been a teacher at the colony school, and he had died trying to protect his students when the bombardment began. Rachel guided her fighter through the space between the capital ships, watching as human point defense systems shot down 90% of the incoming Zaxian missiles before they could reach their targets. The Zaxian commanders watched in confusion as their opening barrage failed to stop the human advance. Then the human ships returned fire and the confusion turned to horror. The weapons that humanity unleashed were nothing like what the Zaxian had faced before. Nanite warheads struck Zaxian cruisers and began dismantling them at the molecular level, the ships literally falling apart as their hull plating dissolved into clouds of component atoms. Directed energy beams cut through Zaxian shields like they weren't even there, cooking the crews alive inside their vessels. Humanity had taken every peaceful technology they had developed over 2 centuries and weaponized it in 3 weeks. A Zaxian destroyer tried to break away from the formation and retreat, but human fighters swarmed over it like angry insects. Rachel fired her weapons into the destroyer's engine section, targeting the weak points that human intelligence had identified through decades of peaceful trade and cultural exchange. The Zaxian had shared technical information freely during those peaceful years, never imagining that humans were quietly cataloging every vulnerability. The destroyer's engines exploded, and the ship began tumbling through space as secondary explosions tore through its interior sections. On the surface of Zaxian Tertius, millions of civilians looked up at their night sky and saw flashes of light as their defense fleet died in orbit. They had celebrated when news of the New Haven massacre reached their world, cheering in the streets because their empire had struck a blow against the expanding humans. Some had even suggested that more human colonies should be destroyed to teach them their place in the galaxy. Now they watched their own fleet being systematically annihilated, and they began to understand what they had awakened. The government broadcasts told them not to worry, that reinforcements were coming, but the people could see the truth in the sky above them. Lieutenant Paul Sanders coordinated the orbital bombardment from his station on the heavy cruiser Retribution. He was 26 years old and had joined the military to see the galaxy, not to become an instrument of destruction. But his sister and her infant son had been at New Haven, and now he felt nothing as he selected targets on the planet below. The rules of engagement were clear. No civilian population centers, but every military installation, every government building, every industrial facility was fair game. Humanity wanted the Zaxian to understand what it meant to have your future destroyed. The bombardment began with surgical precision. Human missiles struck Zaxian military bases, reducing them to craters in seconds. Orbital defense platforms exploded as concentrated beam weapons cut through their armor. The capital city's government district vanished in a series of massive explosions that shattered windows 50 kilometers away. Factories that built Zaxian warships melted under sustained fire from orbit. Within 2 hours, Zaxian Tertius had been knocked back to a pre-industrial state, unable to contribute anything to the Empire's war effort. The other Zaxian systems watched the destruction of Tertius through emergency transmissions, and panic began to spread through the Empire. They sent desperate messages to the Galactic Council, begging for intervention and claiming that humanity was committing war crimes. But the human ambassador to the Council had prepared well. She presented documented evidence of the New Haven massacre, showing that the Zaxian had deliberately targeted children and civilians. She played recordings of Zaxian officials laughing about the attack. She showed the galaxy exactly what kind of enemy humanity was fighting. Most species in the Galactic Council said nothing and simply watched. A few even sent private messages to Earth expressing quiet support for the human actions. The Zaxian had been bullies for generations, conquering weaker species and imposing harsh terms on anyone who challenged their territorial claims. Many races had suffered under Zaxian aggression, but lacked the military strength to resist. Now they watched with satisfaction as humanity did what they had been unable to do. Some species began wondering if they should revise their own diplomatic relationships with Earth. Captain Nicole Brooks commanded the stealth reconnaissance ship Shadow as it approached Zaxian Prime, the Empire's heavily defended homeworld. Her crew of 30 specialists had been training for deep penetration missions for years, but they had never expected to use those skills in actual combat. Nicole's daughter had been at New Haven, a bright 12-year-old girl who wanted to be a scientist when she grew up. Now she was gone, and Nicole channeled her grief into cold professional focus as she guided her ship through the Zaxian sensor network. The Shadow carried technology that made it nearly invisible to conventional detection methods. It used adaptive camouflage that mimicked the background radiation of space, and its engines were designed to produce minimal thermal signature. Nicole brought her ship within weapons range of Zaxian Prime's orbital defense grid and began systematically destroying satellites one by one. The Zaxian didn't even realize they were under attack until half their early warning system was already gone. By the time they figured out something was wrong, it was too late to stop it. Colonel Marcus Green and his team of 48 operators rode down to Zaxian Prime's surface in stealth pods that looked like space debris on radar. They scattered across the planet's upper atmosphere and then descended under parachutes so thin they were almost invisible. Marcus had fought in covert operations on a dozen worlds during his career, always following strict rules about minimizing casualties and avoiding unnecessary violence. Those rules no longer applied. His team had one mission, and they would complete it no matter what it took. The operators landed in the darkness outside the capital city and moved through the urban areas like ghosts. They wore adaptive camouflage suits that adjusted to match their surroundings, and they carried weapons designed for silent killing. The Zaxian security forces were looking for an invasion from space, not realizing that the enemy was already walking among them. Marcus led his team through the city streets, past checkpoints and guard posts, using the information that human intelligence had gathered over years of peaceful contact. They knew the layout of every government building and the schedule of every patrol. The team split into smaller groups, each with specific targets from the Zaxian High Command. These were the officials who had ordered the New Haven massacre, the military commanders who had carried it out, and the politicians who had justified it afterward. Marcus himself led the team that went after the defense minister, the reptilian who had personally authorized the use of heavy bombardment weapons against civilian targets. They found him in his fortified residence surrounded by guards, but the guards were watching the sky for threats and never thought to look at the shadows moving through their security perimeter. The defense minister died in his sleep, never knowing that human operators had been standing over him. The other targets fell just as quickly and just as quietly. By dawn, the entire Zaxian High Command had been eliminated, not by orbital bombardment or missile strikes, but by soldiers who had looked each target in the eye. The Zaxian public woke to find their leadership gone and human forces in orbit above them. The psychological impact was devastating. Humanity had reached into the heart of the Empire and killed whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted. The Zaxian Emperor broadcast an emergency message to all human forces, demanding to know why they were fighting with such brutality and disregard for civilized warfare. He claimed that the New Haven incident had been a tragic mistake, that his commanders had exceeded their authority. He offered to negotiate a ceasefire and discuss reparations. Admiral Patricia Cole received the message on her flagship and prepared her response carefully. She wanted every species in the galaxy to hear what she was about to say. Her message was broadcast on every frequency and translated into every known language. She said that the Zaxion had murdered 3,000 human colonists, including over 1,500 children. She said they had done it deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were doing. She said that Zaxion officials had smiled when discussing the massacre, treating it like a successful business transaction. And then she said the words that would echo across the galaxy for generations. She said that the Zaxion had awakened the other side of humanity, and that side showed no mercy to those who killed children. The war was far from over. The remaining Zaxian fleet gathered at their fortress world of Kragath, a heavily fortified planet that had never fallen in 300 years of warfare. 200 warships assembled in defensive formations around the planet, their commanders determined to make humanity pay in blood for every meter of space they tried to take. The Zaxian believed that Kragath's massive orbital defense platforms and planetary shield generators made it impregnable, and they were confident that the human advance would finally stop here. Commander Daniel Hayes sat in the tactical planning room aboard the fleet command ship and studied the projections that his analysts had prepared. The numbers were brutal and unforgiving. A direct assault on Kragath would cost at least 20,000 human lives, possibly more if the Zaxian fought as hard as expected. Daniel had seen enough death already in this war, and the thought of sending 20,000 more people to die made him feel sick. He brought the analysis to Admiral Patricia Cole, expecting her to order the attack anyway, because Kragath was too strategically important to bypass. Instead, she surprised him by ordering a communication sent to every Zaxian military frequency and civilian broadcast network in the system. The message was simple and clear. Humanity was offering the Zaxian one final chance to surrender unconditionally. They had 72 hours to lay down their weapons and evacuate all military personnel from Kragath. Any civilians who wished to leave would be guaranteed safe passage through human lines. After the deadline expired, no quarter would be given and no mercy would be shown. The Zaxian military command received the message and began laughing, believing that humanity was exhausted and unable to continue the offensive. They saw the offer as weakness and prepared to celebrate their first victory of the war. Lieutenant Amy Foster monitored Zaxian civilian communication channels during those 3 days, listening to conversations between families trying to decide what to do. She sat in a small room filled with translation equipment, headphones covering her ears as she eavesdropped on a society coming apart at the seams. Some Zaxian were packing their belongings and heading for the evacuation points that humanity had designated as safe corridors. Others remained defiant, convinced that their military would drive the humans back. The arguments grew heated as families split over whether to trust the human offer or stay and fight. Amy heard parents arguing with their adult children about the morality of what their empire had done at New Haven. Some of the younger Zaxian had begun questioning whether the massacre had been justified, whether killing human children had really been necessary to defend their territorial claims. The older generation mostly remained firm in their support of the government, but Amy could hear doubt creeping into their voices. They had been told that humans were weak and would collapse under pressure, but the reality of human military power had shattered that illusion completely. On the second day of the deadline, a junior Zaxian naval officer named Kelvor made a decision that would save millions of lives. He had been assigned to monitor human communication intercepts, and his job had given him access to classified files that the Zaxian government had kept hidden from the public. He had seen footage that human rescue workers had recorded at New Haven, showing them weeping as they pulled small bodies from the rubble. He had watched human parents collapse when they learned their children were dead. He had seen the faces of human soldiers as they surveyed the destruction, and he recognized the look in their eyes because he had seen it in his own mirror. Kelvor understood something that his superiors refused to accept. Humanity wasn't waging this war for territory or resources or political advantage. They were executing justice against those who had murdered their children, and they would not stop until that justice was complete. He accessed the military database and copied every piece of tactical information he could find: defense grid codes, shield generator frequencies, fleet deployment patterns, everything that might help the humans minimize casualties on both sides. Then he opened a secure channel to the human fleet and transmitted the data along with a simple message explaining why he was doing this. Admiral Patricia Cole received Kelvor's transmission and spent 30 minutes verifying that it wasn't a trap or disinformation. Her intelligence officers confirmed that the data was genuine and incredibly valuable. She called a meeting with her senior commanders to discuss how to use this information. Some argued for an immediate assault to take advantage of the intelligence before the Zaxian could change their codes. Others worried that using information from a defector might be seen as dishonorable. Patricia listened to both sides and then made her decision based on one simple principle. She wanted to save lives, on both sides if possible. The human fleet began broadcasting evacuation corridors and guaranteed safe passage to any civilian vessel that departed Kragath within the remaining 48 hours. The broadcasts included detailed instructions in the Zaxian language, showing exactly which routes were safe and where refugee ships should go. Patricia authorized her ships to hold fire on any vessel that was clearly marked as civilian and stayed within the designated corridors. She knew that some Zaxian would see this as another sign of weakness, but she also knew that millions of innocent people on Kragath had not voted to massacre New Haven. The evacuation began slowly at first, with only a few ships leaving the planet. But as word spread that the humans were actually honoring their promise of safe passage, the trickle became a flood. Civilian transports lifted off from spaceports across Kragath, carrying families who had decided that surviving was more important than pride. The Zaxian military command screamed betrayal and ordered the civilians to remain on the planet, threatening to shoot down any ship that tried to leave. Some local commanders actually opened fire on civilian vessels, which caused even more people to flee toward the human lines. Captain Stephen Moore watched from his weapons console as refugee ships passed through the human fleet on their way to safety. He had lost his parents at New Haven, both of them retired schoolteachers who had moved to the colony to be near their grandchildren. Stephen had wanted every Zaxian to pay for what happened, but now he watched families escaping and realized that most of them were just ordinary people, caught up in decisions made by their government. He felt conflicted about letting them go, angry that they had celebrated the New Haven massacre, but understanding that many of them had been fed lies by their leaders. By the time the 72-hour deadline expired, more than 15 million Zaxian civilians had evacuated from Kragath. The military garrison remained on the planet along with the hardcore government officials who had refused to accept that they had lost. The Zaxian fleet maintained its defensive formation, preparing for the human assault they were certain was coming. Their commanders sent final messages to their families, wrote letters to be delivered after their deaths, and made peace with whatever gods they believed in. They expected humanity to come at them with overwhelming force, to pay the butcher's bill in blood and bodies. Admiral Patricia Cole stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display showing Kragath and its defenses. She had offered mercy and saved millions of lives, but the deadline had passed and now it was time to show the galaxy what happened to those who refused mercy. She turned to her weapons officer and gave an order that had never been given before in human history. She told him to activate the singularity weapon and target the planet's core. The weapon had been tested in simulations but never used in actual combat, because the destructive power was simply too great. The singularity weapon fired, and for just a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then space itself began to warp and twist around Kragath as the weapon created a miniature black hole at the planet's center. The Zaxian defenders had seconds to realize what was happening before the planet began collapsing in on itself. The 200 warships tried to escape, but the gravitational forces were too strong, pulling them down into the growing singularity. Within 5 minutes, Kragath and everything on it simply ceased to exist, replaced by a small gravitational anomaly that would fade within a few weeks. The destruction was absolute and terrifying. One moment there had been a planet with a massive military garrison and fleet. The next moment there was nothing but empty space and scattered debris. Every Zaxian who had chosen to remain and fight was gone, erased from existence so completely that there wasn't even wreckage left behind. The remaining Zaxian systems watched the recordings that human ships broadcast across the galaxy, and they understood that humanity had offered mercy once. There would not be a second offer. Lieutenant Amy Foster listened to the Zaxian communication channels after Kragath's destruction and heard the change in their voices. The defiance was gone, replaced by fear and horror. They finally understood what they were fighting, finally grasped that humanity had been holding back and could have done this to any of their worlds at any time. The Zaxian people began demanding that their government surrender immediately, that they end this war before humanity erased their entire species from the galaxy. Jake Sullivan sat in the planning room and watched the tactical displays update as Zaxian resistance collapsed across multiple systems. He thought about his sister Caroline and his nieces Emma and Sophie, about how they had died screaming while Zaxian officers smiled. He felt no satisfaction in the victory, no joy in the destruction of Kragath. The people he loved were still dead and nothing would bring them back. But at least the galaxy would remember what happened when you murdered human children. At least other species would think twice before attacking human colonies. The Zaxian Empire sent urgent messages requesting immediate ceasefire negotiations. They offered unconditional surrender, full reparations, and complete acceptance of responsibility for the New Haven massacre. Admiral Patricia Cole received their messages and forwarded them to Earth for a decision. She had done her job, broken the Zaxian military power, and shown the galaxy that humanity could not be pushed around. Now it was time for the politicians and diplomats to decide what came next. But everyone knew that the galaxy had changed forever. 6 months after the war began, the Zaxian Empire signed their unconditional surrender aboard the USS Valiant, the same ship that had first arrived at New Haven to find the ruins of the colony. The ceremony took place in the main conference room, where Zaxian officials sat across from human representatives and signed documents that would reshape their entire civilization. Admiral Patricia Cole watched as the Zaxian ambassador placed his signature on the treaty, his hand shaking slightly as he committed his people to terms that no proud empire wanted to accept. The treaty stated clearly that the Zaxian Empire accepted full responsibility for war crimes committed at New Haven and would pay reparations for the next 100 years. Commander, Lisa Hayes now oversaw the reconstruction efforts on Zaxian worlds that had been damaged during the conflict. She walked through cities where buildings were being rebuilt and infrastructure was being repaired, all funded by human aid programs that many people back on Earth had questioned. Lisa understood why some humans wanted to leave the Zaxian to suffer, wanted them to feel the same pain that New Haven had felt. But she also understood that building a lasting peace required more than just punishment. The children growing up on these worlds hadn't ordered the massacre, and they deserved a chance to learn from their empire's mistakes. The reconstruction came with conditions that made some Zaxian uncomfortable, but were absolutely non-negotiable. Every Zaxian school now included mandatory education about the New Haven massacre, with detailed lessons about what their military had done and why it was wrong. Students were required to study human culture and history to understand the species they had attacked. Museums were built on every major Zaxian world, displaying artifacts recovered from New Haven and telling the stories of the people who had died there. The Zaxian people would never be allowed to forget what their empire had done. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 3 months after the war ended, and the chamber was packed with representatives from every known species. Ambassador Kevin Wright stood at the podium representing humanity, and he presented a proposal that had been drafted by legal experts from a dozen different human worlds. The proposal called for new laws of warfare that would apply to all species in the galaxy.
Any government that deliberately targeted civilians, especially children,
would face immediate collective military action from the entire galactic community. Several species objected to the proposal, claiming that it violated their sovereign right to conduct military operations as they saw fit. A delegate from the Corthian Assembly argued that internal conflicts sometimes required harsh measures, and outside interference would only make situations worse. Another representative suggested that humanity was trying to impose their values on species with very different cultural backgrounds. Kevin listened to the objections and then yielded the floor to someone who could speak with more authority than any diplomat. Admiral Patricia. Cole entered the council chamber still wearing her military uniform, and the room fell silent as she walked to the podium. She had not planned to address the council, preferring to let the diplomats handle the political discussions. But she had listened to the objections and realized that some species still didn't understand the fundamental point. She looked around the chamber at representatives from worlds that had never faced human military power, and she spoke in a voice that carried absolute conviction. She told them that humanity had not wanted this war, had not wanted to become the species that could erase entire planets from existence. She explained that humans preferred peace and cooperation and diplomatic solutions to problems. But she also made it crystal clear that every species in the chamber needed to understand something important. Humanity had two sides, and the galaxy had just seen what happened when you forced humans to show their other side. If any species ever attacked human colonies again, if anyone murdered human children and smiled about it, they would face the full weight of human military power with no restraint and no mercy. The council chamber remained silent for several seconds after she finished speaking. Then the voting began and the proposal passed with an overwhelming majority. Even some of the species that had initially objected changed their votes after hearing Patricia's words. The Zaxian delegate, one of the few officials who had opposed the New Haven massacre from the beginning and somehow survived the war, voted in favor of the new laws. He understood better than anyone what his people had awakened, and he wanted to make sure no other species made the same mistake. Captain Jake Sullivan stood at the memorial that had been built on the ruins of New Haven, a massive stone structure carved with 3,000 names arranged by family groups. He found his sister Caroline's name and placed fresh flowers beneath it, then did the same for his nieces Emma and Sophie. The anger that had driven him through the war had slowly faded over the month since the surrender, replaced by a deep exhaustion and sadness that he suspected would never fully go away. They had won the war and punished those responsible, but the children were still dead and nothing could change that. The memorial had become a place of pilgrimage for humans across the galaxy. Families came to pay respects to those who had died, and military units visited to remind themselves why they served. The Zaxian government had offered to help rebuild the colony, but humanity had declined and chosen instead to leave New Haven as it was. The ruins would stand forever as a reminder of what had happened here, as a warning to anyone who thought they could attack human families without consequence. Dr. Helen Price returned to her research facility and personally oversaw the sealing of the weapons vaults. The terrible technologies that had been unleashed during the war went back into storage, locked away behind security systems that would take extraordinary circumstances to open again. Helen hoped that she would never see those weapons used again, that the lesson taught to the Zaxian would be enough to prevent future conflicts. But she was not naive enough to believe that humanity could simply forget how to be dangerous. The knowledge existed now, and it could not be unlearned. Veterans of the war began returning home to their families, carrying invisible scars that would take years to heal. They had seen things and done things that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Therapists and counselors worked overtime, trying to help soldiers process what they had experienced, trying to help them find their way back to normal life after months of unrestricted warfare. Some adapted well and moved on, while others struggled with the memories of what they had become during the darkest days of the conflict. The human military underwent significant changes in the aftermath of the war. Fleet strength was reduced from its wartime peak but remained much larger than it had been before New Haven. New bases were established in strategic locations throughout human space, and early warning systems were upgraded to ensure that no human colony would ever again be caught unprepared. The military academies revised their training programs based on lessons learned during the conflict, and a new generation of officers studied the campaigns that had broken the Zaxian Empire. Trade slowly resumed between human and Zaxian worlds, though relationships remained complicated and difficult. Some humans refused to do business with any Zaxian, unable to forgive what their empire had done. Others believed that economic integration was essential for preventing future wars. The Zaxian people themselves were divided, with younger generations often ashamed of their empire's actions and older citizens struggling to accept how completely their military had been defeated. Other species in the galaxy watched humanity carefully, trying to understand this race that could switch so dramatically between peace and total war. Diplomatic relationships shifted as various governments reassessed their positions toward Earth and its colonies. Some species that had been cool toward humanity now sought closer ties, while others maintained cautious distance. Everyone understood that the balance of power in the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Commander Rachel Torres left the military and returned to civilian life, taking a job flying cargo ships between Earth and the outer colonies. She found peace in the routine of commercial flight, in the simple task of transporting goods from one place to another without anyone shooting at her. But she kept her military flight suit in her closet, cleaned and ready just in case it was ever needed again. She hoped it never would be, but like many veterans, she understood that hope was not the same as certainty. The Galactic Council established a new monitoring system to watch for potential atrocities and prevent future New Havens. Mixed species inspection teams were given authority to investigate reports of civilian targeting, and the major military powers agreed to rapid response protocols if another massacre occurred. The system was imperfect and would require constant adjustment, but it represented a genuine attempt by the galactic community to prevent the kind of tragedy that had started the war. Ambassador Kevin Wright worked tirelessly to rebuild human relationships with species that had been uncertain about which side to support during the conflict. He attended countless diplomatic functions, gave hundreds of speeches, and spent endless hours in negotiations over trade agreements and defense treaties. He wanted the galaxy to remember that humanity was capable of both incredible violence and incredible compassion, that the species that had destroyed Kragath was also the species that had saved millions of Zaxian civilians. Admiral Patricia Cole retired from active military service 1 year after the war ended, choosing to spend her remaining years with her family rather than continuing to command fleets. She had done what needed to be done, had shown the galaxy that humanity could not be pushed around, and now it was time for someone else to carry that burden. She gave one final speech at her retirement ceremony, reminding the officers who would replace her that the greatest military victory was the war you prevented through strength and deterrence. Jake Sullivan visited New Haven one last time, before accepting a teaching position at the Naval Academy. He wanted to train the next generation of officers, wanted to make sure they understood not just tactics and strategy, but also the human cost of warfare. He stood at the memorial and said goodbye to his sister and nieces, promising them that their deaths would not be forgotten and that humanity would never again allow such a massacre to happen. The galaxy settled into a new normal, a reality where humanity was recognized as a major military power, alongside their reputation as peaceful explorers. The Zaxian Empire slowly rebuilt under the terms of the treaty. Their reduced military focused on system defense rather than conquest. Other aggressive species reconsidered their expansion plans, calculating whether territorial gains were worth the risk of facing human retaliation. Children across human space grew up hearing stories about New Haven and the war that followed. Parents used those stories to teach lessons about justice and the importance of protecting innocent people. The stories became part of human culture, passed down through generations as a reminder of what humanity could become when pushed too far. The lesson was clear, and it spread throughout the galaxy. You could negotiate with humanity, and you could compete with humanity, and you could even fight humanity in honorable warfare. But if you murdered human children and smiled about it, you would face the other side of humanity, and that side showed no mercy until justice was served. The galaxy remembered and the galaxy learned. And New Haven became a name that every species knew, a warning carved in stone and written in the stars. Humanity had proven they could be peaceful builders of civilization, but they had also proven they could be the most dangerous species in the galaxy when their families were threatened. The choice of which side to face was entirely up to those who chose to interact with them. The Zaxian had made their choice and paid the price. No other species wanted to repeat that mistake.